morning, or not good morning, it's good afternoon, everyone. Do a little bit of pre-chiming for us. Nice to see you all. Some very familiar and welcome faces on this, in this confusing, hang on, somebody's sending me a message, so hang on one second. Ro, are you trying to send me a message? Okay, sorry. Wow, what a week, friends. What a perfect moment to have nourishment in the form of this gathering and with our very, very special guest, Pedrego Toma. I'm not sure if you all had a chance to listen to the first episode of Poetry Unbound, but it's a beautiful one if you haven't already heard it. And so I look really forward to both the conversation and the poem. So what we're going to do today, for those of you, so raise your hand if you are a returning mindful gatherer. Let me see who all our returning folks are. Wonderful. Some of you have your video off, so I can't quite tell, which is fine. And then let me just see the hands of some of the new folks. So we have Berdine and Betsy, Ben. Let's see, who else do we have in here? Oh my gosh, it's so good to see everyone. Alrighty. So we'll get started now officially. It looks like all of our special guests have arrived. So for those of you who are returning, as well as some of our new friends, I want to just tell you how we frame up our time together. We've been doing a fairly consistent frame for our gatherings. So my name is Stacy Sims, and I'm the founder of The Well. And a few years ago, with the help of Eddie Gonzalez, if you would wave at us, from the Civil Conversations part of the On Being Project, we've come together to do mindful poetry moments. Our first connection was creating mindful poetry for students to listen to in schools, which is a sister program to our mindful music moments. We had planned on doing our second year last April. We had also planned on doing a gathering in person in Cincinnati with my friends Troy Bronsink, if you could wave your hand, from the Hive in Cincinnati, and Amy Tuttle with WordPlay. And also, I'm not sure if our other friend Amy is here yet, but another wonderful Amy from the Mercantile Library. Well, guess what happened? A global pandemic. So we couldn't meet in person, but we created this format for virtual gatherings. And it was such extraordinary nourishment during those very difficult first weeks that we continued. And we also created our compilation of the pandemic collection, poems that we wrote inspired by poems and poets. And we decided that we should definitely keep meeting once a month for the second season of Poetry Unbound, which is just launched this Monday. And I'm not sure about the rest of you, but boy, oh boy, is this week the perfect time to breathe and connect and find meaning. So I'm going to kick us off with a short grounding meditation. Then we're going to turn it over to our special guest, Pedrego Toma, to talk about and present the poem from this week's podcast, the season starter. We will spend time writing together. We'll just take 12 minutes or so and in our own quiet spaces, write to what we've been prompted to feel and express. And then we'll come back and we're going to stay in the big group. And if you're so inclined, you'll raise your hand and we'll listen to what the writings are. And then we have another way of sharing them with the group if you want to share later. So how's that sound, everybody? Like a good frame? All right. So I was so inspired by the Monday's episode of Poetry Unbound. And I was thinking about that doing a meditation seems almost redundant when we have Padraig in the room, because he is just a human living meditation. But two things struck me in the podcast. One was the idea that poetry doesn't try to tell you the story of everything. It tells you the story of a moment. And in those moments, that's where we find fortitude. And I think the same about meditation. I think oftentimes we want to solve too big of a story in our quiet time, when really what we're doing is just finding the story of that moment. And within the story of that moment, with that breath, etc., that's where we find and replenish our own fortitude to move forward in the most productive way, in the most connected way possible. So let's hunker down. So even though we're probably very used to the space and place where we're sitting, just take a second and encounter your room, your space in the moment, as though never seeing it before. Orient to your surroundings with delight. Colors, patterns, beautiful objects that you or someone has collected. Moving your body and your spine in circular manner is really nourishment for the nervous system. That also prepares us to just get a little grounded. So find your sitting bones, maybe rock back and forth a bit. If your feet are on the floor, nestle them in and feel your body yield to this moment. Your inhaling is your anticipation, your belief that beauty awaits. And your exhale, maybe your big sigh, is your resting, digesting, and integrating. So just notice for a second this moment. The other thing that struck me, or one of the other things that struck me in the podcast on Monday, and my guess is Padraig may talk a little bit more about this, but there's a alliterative pairing and the power of two words that begin with the same letter. So I was thinking of body breath. Feel your body breath. The inhale and the exhale. The story of this moment. Where we can find our own fortitude. Just enough of it to be present to the next 50 minutes of beauty. So let's rejoin. And let's turn it over to Padraig, if you wouldn't mind unmuting yourself. And welcome, welcome, welcome.
Thanks very much. Hello, everybody. It's nice to see you all. It's nice to be in the room with you. I'm Padraig from On Being, and together with Eddie and a bunch of others, I'm part of the team of people who put together Poetry Unbound, a podcast from On Being, where we take a poem and read it and then reflect on it and then read it again. And we're going to look at the poem from this week, or the first one from the launch of season 2. But first of all, I wanted to say a thing or two about language, and then a thing or two about public language, and then invite us to respond to a prompt, which is just a single line prompt, which we'll look at in the chat here. I think that language really is one of the primal impulses that we seem to recognize. If you look at the sacred scriptures of so many different religions and cultures, as they're trying to describe the beginning of the world, someone somewhere speaks. And that might be the mouth of a god, or that might be the mouth of a person, it might be the mouth of an animal, but they speak. And I think one of the things that that shows us is the human fascination with what language does. And then on another level, it shows us the human fascination with the need to tell a story about the past in order to make sense about today. And somehow by doing that, you're not trying to say this is exactly what happened. Nobody's saying that. But you're saying this makes meaning today. That brings me into a kind of an ethical way of living, brings me into an imaginative way of living, helps me maybe feel a little bit less alone, and helps me also to have a way of thinking that holds me to account to a body of literature and a body of language that is a challenge as well as an embrace. And I think that's a really important thing to pay attention to. My phone is annoying me here, just turning it off. And yeah, so I think that's the first thing to say regarding language and story. And then last night I couldn't sleep. And so I watched the debate, the American presidential whatever that's called. We're 5 hours ahead here, so I think it started at 3 a.m. So I put it on and watched and thought over and over again about language and story, because I knew we were coming here tonight, and the failure of language coming from the incumbent, and what it is that language can do to fuck up what it means to be human, and how fast that can happen, and how derailing it is, and what it's like when language in small moments is just broken and broken and broken and broken, and what that does to an incapacity to imagine that there's the possibility of being listened to. And then the fracturing that comes from that begins and continues. And that is also, unfortunately, an old technology. So I think we have this week the demonstration of a diabolical story being embodied in a broadcasted way through that. And then we have an Ada Limon, a way within which she's turning to an old story. And I think it's useful to hold these two things together as a demonstration about having story that's good enough to hold us to account, and language that's good enough to create, not to destroy. The response that I'd like you to think of is, what do you turn to for strength? Like, I think if Ada Limon were here, she might say, Wonder Woman, of course. What are you on about? What do you turn to for strength? I'm not looking for anything that's overly literary, although if it's very literary, that's lovely too. I am reading James Joyce's Ulysses at the moment, which is magnificent, and I kind of feel like I should be high fairly regularly in order to make any sense of it. So it might be a very literary thing. It might be a story from your family, and I'd love it if you drop it into the messages. But don't hit send yet. Just drop it in. Yeah. And then in a while, we can all press send, and it'll all cascade down beautifully like a waterfall. I stole this from somebody last week. Thanks, Stephen and Sarah. The prompt is, what do you turn to for strength? What story do you turn to for strength? What story do you turn to for strength? this doesn't have to be one that's well known. It might be something about somebody in your community, somebody in your family. It might be something from your own life to say, that time I did that thing. So if everyone can write it in, and in a while I'll say go, and you can press send, and then we'll watch it all cascade. But I'll give you 20 seconds just to do that. So, go. Beautiful. I'm going to look at some of these and read them out, but I'm sure we'll all be reading them out too. And I think they're all in different order, which is delicious. For strength, the immigrant story, my breath, and my now healed broken bones. Giving birth to twins, my God, yes. One day at a time, a 12-step story. The time I hiked Mount LeConte when I didn't think I could. Memories of the courage and love of my grandmother. The bottom drops out into wholeness. Dylan's music and its characters. Thor Kettle. Did I say that correctly, Amy? You can correct me. I did? Okay. Phone calls with my family, my dad and mom, my sister and brother, grandparents, and their stories of perseverance through difficulty and their love. Trees and the birds who live in them. Story of the inner wise woman. My jaguar dream. Wow, that's such an evocative thing. I wonder, is that about a car or about an actual animal? The story of my great-grandma. Rain in words. The courage of my mom's last breath. 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 words in there, Christine, and what an extraordinary world is created in those 7 words. Bird watching near the ocean. Sarah is saying, I've gone through worse. Listening to the music of my childhood in my dad's oversized leather chair. I love the idea of service to poetry, something Cecilia Vicuña once said to me about how disappointed she was after a long day doing other things that we had not served poetry that day. And then I realized it was possible to spend every day in service. Lovely. Courage, courage, courage of my patience every day. Beautiful. What a lovely series of things we turn to. One of the things I like to do when it comes to a poem, and a poem that I like, is once I've been in it to think, I wonder what prompt might have been in that poet's mind that got them going with the energy of the poem. And then obviously I always think that a poem arrives with its own energy, with its own orbit, and then the poet applies craft to it. But that there's something that knew itself first that landed on the page. And there was a molecule of an idea that said, I have something to say. And one of the things that I think might have been behind this is Ada Limon's poem is, what gives you strength? And she thought of this moment and thought of this embodiment. So we'll read it, and then I'll talk about it a bit, and then we'll have a chance to hear each other, and then there'll be a writing prompt as well. So Wonder Woman by Ada Limon. And this is from her magnificent book, The Carrying, which is published by Milkweed Editions. They are a Minneapolis-based press, and they do wonderful things. And Ben is holding it up for us right now. Thank you very much, Ben. You'd swear you had that planned. So Wonder Woman. Standing at the swell of the muddy Mississippi after the urgent care doctor had just said, well, sometimes shit happens. I fell fast and hard for New Orleans all over again. Pain pills swirled in the purse along with a spell for later. It's taken a while for me to admit I am in a raging battle with my body, a spinal column 35 degrees bent, vertigo that comes and goes like a DC Comics villain nobody can kill. Invisible pain is both a blessing and a curse. You always look so happy, said a stranger once as I shifted to my good side, grinning. But that day, alone on the riverbank, brass blaring from the steamboat Natchez. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw a girl, maybe half my age, dressed for no apparent reason as Wonder Woman. She strutted by in all her strength and glory, invincible, eternal. And when I stood to clap, because who wouldn't have, she bowed and posed like she knew I needed a myth, a woman by a river, indestructible. I find that poem such an uplifting piece of magnificence. I don't think I've ever read it and not smiled while I'm reading it, because there's something in it. I love the line, because who wouldn't have? The way that she's there, she's in pain, and she's got pain medication and a spell for later. That could mean all kinds of things. And it seems like she's sat down, but yet, and she is in pain, and she describes her spinal column, and yet she stands up to clap. What an amazing thing that happens. She who has sought to sit down is suddenly standing because of some shared energy of watching. I love too the girl's capacity to hold attention. She strutted by in all her strength and glory, invincible, eternal, and then she bowed and posed like she knew I needed a myth. So many of us, and cultures are like this. Irish culture can be often like this. If you get praised, you say, no, stop, I'm terrible, I'm awful. And I think lots of us carry that within us too. It's not just cultural, it can be based on gender, it can be based on age, it can be based on your educational experience. People are often taught how to navigate what it means to be in public by this technology of putting yourself down, because the threat of accepting a compliment can sometimes be very high, where if you accept something, people can really cut you. But this girl in her Wonder Woman costume owns it, and she isn't trying to be anything other than herself, and that in itself creates some kind of shared magic, something beautiful. Stacey had mentioned earlier on that there are these delicious pieces of alliteration in it. And alliteration, Wonder Woman, kind of out of alliteration and assonance are two things that we'd often have heard about in poetry classes in school. Alliteration is the way the word starts, Wonder Woman, that's alliteration. And assonance is where vowel sounds are created between words. So it's not often at the beginning of a sound that you'll get, beginning of a word that you'll get assonance, but usually it's somewhere in the middle. And Irish language poetry is absolutely built on creating rhythms and structures of elongated vowel sounds that create their own music. It's something to look at sometimes when you're writing your own poems and going back into it to craft it, to think, I wonder, can I find something else that isn't a formal rhyme but does pick up this repeated vowel sound, and it can sound like the poem is singing. That's what we often talk about in the musicality of a poem, the way that there's vowel sounds that hold it together, that you feel rather than hear. But the alliteration in this poem is so important. Muddy Mississippi, sometimes shit happens, fell fast, pain pills in the purse, battle with my body, pain as both blessing, and then said a stranger, good side grinning, brass blaring Wonder Woman, strutted strength, who wouldn't, knew I needed. And form in a poem is always there to serve the purpose of the poem. It's not just to make you seem clever. And here we see that the form of this poem, building all of these little alliteration pairs the whole way along, somehow this poem is saying, I know where we're going. And where we're going is to people, not just to sounds, to people who together form a magnificence. The woman watching the girl. And so all of these little repeated pairs, she's not shouting about it. She's not saying, this is what the poem is doing. She's just letting it happen. And she's used form to serve the purpose. Sometimes I think people write form because they want to seem really, really clever. And those poems never move you. But I'm always interested in thinking, I have a poem to write. And is there a form that will hold that poem? And maybe if I just begin to write it, there will be a form that knows itself. Suddenly I realize, my God, I keep on coming back to alliteration or to single line paragraph or single line stanzas or something that somehow there's something there that knows itself. And when you're writing, I think it's a lovely and important question to ask yourself, what is the intelligence of this poem? What does it know? And that helps you in an editorial way too, which isn't just about removing stuff that you think is complicated or cumbersome, but it helps you to think, no, that's dross, because this poem knows that sparse language is needed, or this poem knows that effusive language is needed, or this poem knows that we need lots of vowel sounds or lots of single syllable words after each other for a few sentences, or a few short sentences. All of these things, but paying attention to your first draft that you've written without stopping can be really helpful to know the intelligence of the thing that's trying to tell you something. Because often I think the page was my first therapist. I needed to write so that what I was writing could say something back to me that I couldn't cope with. I needed some kind of prayer or scripture on a page that had just been written right there and then, that was only for the God of the page and me in some kind of conversation. And opening that up then suddenly makes you think, check it out. I'd love to hear a couple of other comments, and then we'll have a prompt. Anybody's welcome to talk. Tell me where you are too, because I'm always excited about where people are. I'm in a small house in the northwest of Ireland.
So I'm Stacy in Bellevue, Kentucky, across from Cincinnati, Ohio, the state of Mitch McConnell. So among other things, it makes me think about, I saw Toni Morrison several times, but when she had written the libretto for an opera based on Beloved, I went to the panel discussion and they asked her something to the effect of what was difficult about writing the libretto. And she said, well, I had to take the music out of all my language because it wasn't her job anymore to create that musicality in the language. And and frankly, I think she did a better job of it than the actual musicians. So I love the idea of thinking about language and what kind of language will serve the natural form of the story. So thank you about that.
Okay. Thanks, Daisy. Other people, something in the poem that strikes you, or something that sparks in your mind from yourself as you look at this magnificent poem from Ada Limon.
I'll say something. I'm Lauren.
Yeah, thanks, Lauren.
Brooklyn, New York, and yeah, as a mom to 7-year-old daughters, it's like aspirational to to teach them to bow and pose, and there's something like really generational connection wise that's happening in that moment that I think is like really empowering. So it's like there's like a tiny circle of empowerment that happens with this viral thing. Yeah, I love that.
Thanks. Sarah.
One thing that I just loved about this poem, and I already listened to this on Poetry Unbound, so this is a treat. I didn't know we were going to talk about it again. So beautiful. I loved the chemistry between the two of them, and that neither of them, sometimes I think I'm feeling chemistry with someone and then I'll get shy and be like, oh, it might be in my own head. And so I love that neither of them did that. They were just like, we are all in, I see you, you see me. And it was just a beautiful moment. And I just love women and girls and the intergenerational thing. I just felt like a little shower of love for women and girls during that moment. And so it just, that blessed me, I guess. Yeah,
you're getting all kind of snaps from around the place. It is so uplifting, isn't it? As a man reading that poem, I don't feel excluded, but I do feel like I'm watching something that's happening that is a female narrative that's happening between people speaking to each other in their bodies. And the embodied nature about what's happening here is so powerful. And the holding of that, and somehow the connection with Wonder Woman is a connection to myth as well, you know. Wonder Woman is elevated suddenly from a DC Comics hero from the mid 20th century into a god, which is so important, I think, to recognize that. I do have a great love for Wonder Woman. I must put that out there. So I have loved her since I was a child. So I hate Superman. He's annoying. He's like Jesus. He shows up and solves everything. Wonder Woman shows up and gets involved. So somebody else. I think we edited that bit out of the episode when I talked about not liking Superman.
No, yeah, I didn't hear that part. So I'm Ben.
Oh, Ben. And then Julie after
Milwaukee, Wisconsin. And I have a 10-year-old son who has watched, every Marvel movie. So this is DC Comics, but every Marvel movie I've watched them with him. He's probably watched them like 4 or 5 times. But I'm struck by how it, like, speaking to what you were just talking about, Padraig, like in the pantheon of these mythical comic book characters, like they're predominantly male. And so I think part of why this works so powerfully is like, this speaking very specifically to a feminine experience, or there's power in the fact that it's Wonder Woman. My daughter's eyes lit up so I have 2 daughters similar age, and we saw the Wonder Woman movie, and they can see themselves in that story. And now they're also waiting for there's a Marvel movie coming out that got delayed. Anyways, with Black Widow. Anyways, all that is to say, there's power in that. Like it's just amazing how something that's become so common and mainstream, first in comics and now in movies, is able to speak to us at such deep levels. And I think the fact that it's Wonder Woman is probably why it works that way. Yeah.
We'll come to you, Julie, in just a sec, but like politically, visibility is so important. And that's why in so many situations we recognize that quotas can work, because it's not like working with quotas diminishes quality. It increases quality, because not working in quotas has not served us well, and it has diminished quality when it's just been white men, speaking as one. And so I think the visibility of Wonder Woman in cinema has been so important. And the poem, I think, is taking it deeper than just what a comic is doing, because the poem is saying in visibility, we each turn towards each other and get strength from each other by seeing and being seen. Wonder Woman. Who is the Wonder Woman in this? Is it the character from the comics? I don't think so. Is it the poet? Is it the girl? It's all of them. And then that last line, a woman by a river, indestructible. Suddenly I feel like we're back to a proto-history, and this is beginning a proto-history, not in a Garden of Eden somewhere. It's beginning with a woman by a river, indestructible, the beginning of the world. And what an important thing that this poem is doing here. So, Julie.
Thank you. I think I'm going to go ahead and overturn some of that and say,
okay. Thank you.
That I really appreciate the nuance in this poem too, though, about what visibility means and invisibility, in the way that sometimes invisible pain is a blessing and a curse, right? The poem says. And
such knowledge.
So there's a lot in this poem about what it means when we miss each other and when we don't see each other as well as when we do. Someone saying, you look so happy on the surface. Right? And yet being aware that this person is bodily in pain. And the poem preserves that even at the end, right? When it says, she bowed and posed like she knew I needed a myth, so there's still the interjection of a little bit of doubt, which I think is important, right? Because it doesn't then sort of appropriate or colonize that girl's identity, right? It introduces a little bit of doubt and reminds us that this is sort of like conjecture and the kind of speculation that we do about others on a regular basis. We make our best interpolations in the world in relation to one another, and yet we're always in this process of translation that is in some ways fated to fail. And that's sort of if there's one thing that we do definitely have in common, it is that we can't really cross that intersubjective gulf. you know. And so I just thought that that was really beautiful in the poem. And yet at the same time, the poem does give us what you're saying, this moment of like mutual recognition, mirroring, and in many ways, you know, how someone treats us tells us a lot about, you know, who we are and helps construct our identities too, you know. So it's just a really remarkable poem.
Thanks, Julie.
Read it.
Julie and I have been in a room together at Eastern Mennonite University stuff over the last couple of weeks, so it's nice to hear you. Let's take a little bit of time for writing. I suppose I'd like you to think of what you think the prompt for this poem was and to write to that. And there isn't just one prompt to this poem. You know, the poem could be, what does the body know? And how is the body betrayed by what other people think the body is saying, okay? It could be saying, what's your favorite comic hero? It could be saying, what happened one day when you were at the end of yourself? There could be all kinds of things that were the prompt to this. So have a scan through the poem and just think, for now, what do I think the prompt was? And then write to that. And the for now there is really important, because tomorrow the poem will speak to you in a different way, but I think the poem is calling out to you with a message to say, for now, for you, here's what this prompt was, and then respond to that with yourself. And let all of this, oh yes, thank you, Heather. I'm going to put it inside the chat here, which obviously won't keep the line breaks, but I'm also going to look at it.
Ro can also put it on the screen for us.
Oh, perfect.
And I'll go ahead and start the timer, and we'll write for about 10 to 12 minutes. let's take another minute or so to write to the end of our thought. Alrighty, friends. I'm going to turn it back over to Padraig to guide us through any sharings.
So what I thought we'd do for our sharing is if you could look at what you've written and ask yourself, in seeing what you've written down, what does it know? What is its intelligence? And maybe what does it need? And I don't mean that in terms of craft or form or editing, but what is its hunger? What does it know? And what's its hunger? Doing this reflection at an early stage of a piece of writing, I think, invites us to be serving intuition rather than just craft. I'm all about craft. I love craft. I love form. It's fantastic. But craft for craft's sake isn't enough. This poem needs to continue to know how to be edited into its own indigenous knowledge of itself and its own indigenous hunger. The piece of itself that is vulnerable, that is always going to be unfinished, that's always going to be a failure, because every poem's a failure. That's the whole point, is to write good failures. And by knowing that you will never manage to perfectly capture the intelligence and the hunger of the poem, that allows you, I think, to be brave in making editorial decisions. And I think knowing the hunger and the intelligence of a poem is one of the things that helps us make really brave craft decisions when it comes to editing or introducing some particular kind of form. So that's particularly what I'd love to hear from you as you'd share. What is it? What does this poem know? And what is its hunger? And then you can maybe read a little bit from it, but it's particularly the other two things that I'm really interested in, because that creates a sense of community. Because very quickly when we're writing, it becomes performative. Will this go into a submission I'm making? Will this be accepted here? Can I do something with this? And suddenly we begin to turn it into a strategic plan. And poems aren't strategic plans. Poems arise out of need. And I think that that's the more tools we can use to be mindful about that and to continue to draw us back to the intelligence of the poem, the more integral the poem will be. And then we begin to do what I think is lacking in the debate last night from the current president, in terms of there was no intuitive knowledge and there was no communication of hunger there. There was other things, dominance, for instance. And I think we know we can create hells unless we do this work. So let's hear from some of you. What intuitive knowledge does your poem have, and what hunger? So is it Deb Daniel? I see your name.
Yes.
Yeah. Hi, Deb.
Hi. This was the second poem I wrote from the prompt. The first was not very good. But this one really captured what I wanted. Yesterday I heard Joshua Bell in YouTube, and I was flushed with pride for our human endeavors and our wonderful prehensile fingers.
Did your voice dropped out for me just for a couple of seconds, Deb? Was that the same for other people? I saw a few people raise their hand. So I wonder,
Do you want me to
do it
again?
Yeah, thank you.
Yesterday, I heard Joshua Bell playing violin in a subway video on YouTube, and I was flush with pride for our human endeavors and our wonderful fingers, prehensile.
Prehensile. What a lovely word to include in a poem. What for you is the intelligence of this poem? What does the poem know?
That humans are remarkable in some ways.
And what is its hunger?
We're not remarkable in all ways.
Wow, what an interesting. I mean, knowing those two things will mean that as this poem develops, some interesting things will come out, and a magnificent tension. Thank you. Somebody else? Thanks, Deb. Oh, is that Berdine? Berdine?
Hi, it's Berdine, and I'm in Lunenburg, Nova Scotia.
Oh.
Yeah, for me, the voice during the discussion that stood out was the person who wrongfully said, "But you look so happy today," and it made me feel guilt for all the times that I may have misspoken when my sister-in-law was going through chemo for breast cancer. And so that's part of the intelligence from my poem, is that acknowledgement and the apology and the guilt for, I wonder how many times I've done that. And so I'll just read a small part. I said, I know it's rude to chew with your mouth open, but I'm not sure I can close it for all the feet I've filled it with. How many times and in how many ways have my well-intentioned words withered your resolve or drained the air from your lungs? Would that I could floss away every last tippy toe and with clean teeth chew over our companionable silence.
What's the hunger of this poem, Berdine?
No, I was just struck by that the sense of needing to tell her and that apology, to acknowledge that even in all the conversations of everything that's happening in the States with the Black Lives Matter, and just how inept we seem to know how to speak to it, and how we seem to stumble over everything, and everyone is saying everything wrong and unintentionally offending everyone else. Yeah, that's the hunger, to know what to say. What's the right thing to say?
Thank you. You can see how knowing the hunger and the intelligence of a poem helps you to think, what voice am I going to drop in? What image am I going to drop in? Does the furniture in the poem serve the purpose of the poem's intelligence? Furniture is a lovely word to use when it comes to later on. I mean, a stanza is just the Italian word for room. So each poem is a room or a series of rooms. And it's worthwhile thinking, what's the furniture in those rooms? Are they serving their purpose? Do they need to be put in the basement? Or is this poem about the basement? Somebody else. Anna.
All right, thank you. I'm in San Antonio, by the way, San Antonio, Texas.
Oh, magnificent. I'm adjunct at St. Mary's University in San Antonio.
Oh, far out, yeah, that's great. So I just wrote a quick thing. I am the woman bent in pain. I know vertigo all too well, unfortunately. I keep the pain pills handy because sometimes shit happens. I am Wonder Woman, strong, glorious, invincible, bangles caught by the wind. I am my own myth, bent in pain, indestructible.
Thank you. Thank you, Anna. That's so beautiful. you've done such interesting things with the furniture of Ada Lemon's poem and then added into it, and bangles, magnificent. I was very excited about the bangles. And then also the bent and indestructible at the end is doing such powerful work. What would you say the intelligence of what you wrote is? What does it know?
Well, I think that we are, each of us, strong, that sometimes we don't think that we are. But we each have our own strengths, that even when we are at our weakest, even when we are at most in pain, the fact that we are still able to take a breath in and exhale again means that we are wonderful beyond measure.
And what's the poem's hunger?
To take that breath in and to exhale, to acknowledge that wonder.
Thank you. I think we've got time for one more, and then I'm going to say a few things about Jung and dream interpretation, which I'm sure some of you know a lot more about than me, but somebody else? Oh, Christine has to go to class. All the best, Christine. Grace, I see you there. You're still muted, Grace, if you're talking.
Sorry, one of my problems is I can't hear. So that's actually a changing thing. I was thinking about how people don't understand, you know, these disabilities they can't see. I actually lost hearing in 1 year last year, and it's been kind of a changing situation. So
yeah, sure.
Anyway, I hadn't heard your show before this. I wish I had. The whole question about what the body knows is what really struck me, and particularly watching that debate and wondering, should I have even watched that? It was so painful, so painful. And so I guess I wrote this poem in response to that. And also I should say, I live in Scotts Valley, so I'm one of those gatherers. At least some of you are part of that On Being gathering. So I'm probably the only one that went there that was actually from Scotts Valley. So anyway, this is my poem. The body knows the animal hurt of another human being broken by constant cruelty. The body knows the authentic aura of the ones who can love. The body knows the tick-tock of time changes everything. The body knows it needs the spacious skies and the roar of the waves on the seashore to regenerate.
Thank you. What would you say is the intelligence of your poem, Grace? Those words, animal hurt, really struck me. What would you say the intelligence of the poem is?
I think of what we really do know. The one thing I wanted to say is I was like, can I use Wonder Woman in this poem? And I just didn't feel like I could quite pull that off, but I do have a little story about Wonder Woman. I teach Tai Chi, and I was at a course learning a certain form, which is a series of movements. And one of the movements ends up where you're kind of like this, but you're down by your lower body, which is a real powerful energy spot. So you're like this, and the teacher said, it's like Wonder Woman. And everybody went, yeah, you know, and then I started teaching it to my students, and you could see people transforming with this. And I thought, I need to do a poem about that, but yeah. I couldn't quite fit it right now. But
it will come, yeah.
Anyway, I think just because I've always felt really strongly that we know people's hurt on a certain level, and sometimes we push it away. We don't want to know it. And that's really what I was trying to get across. But also that we have this wisdom within us, but also that we need ways to be able to heal when, particularly like last night. I mean, I literally went to sleep trying to just get it out of my mind. And when I woke up, it was like, what happened? And this morning I told my husband, we have to go somewhere. We have to go somewhere outside so I can just get some air and see. And we're lucky because I live 6 miles from the Pacific Ocean. So we went down to the ocean. We saw like about 4 different kinds of hawks, and we saw this bird, this yellow-throat bird, which they say they're everywhere, and we never see them, you know, so we saw one today. So it was kind of like these little miracles that just help you kind of, I just feel like it resets everything. It kind of just is a way to rebalance. Yeah, so I don't know what else to say.
Well, you've said it's magnificent. I'm like you, I think. I'm when I speak, I begin to hear what I'm saying. I'm fairly extroverted. I need time alone, but I'm extroverted. And just in the way that you spoke there, you mentioned some words that I think could do beautifully in your poem. Hawk and yellowthroat, beautiful. How amazing. Pacific. Think of like those as little lists of words that you could put into that poem that you wrote. Just there, Grace. Thank you. Depends as to who you are. Some of you can do that work in terms of talking about it out loud by yourself. Some of you need a friend. Some of you can just do it by writing. And I think the thing is to know, what does it mean? What do you need? And who are you? And what helps? The thing I wanted to say about Jung, and it's not, I mean, it was older than Jung really. One of the things that Jung suggested when you're thinking about a poem is that you go into each character of the poem and you say, I am the lampstand that was in my poem. It doesn't have to be a persona character. I am the grandparent in the poem. I am the stranger. And you get them each to describe themselves in the first person. And by going into that to say, I am this, then you begin to go, my God, why do I know that? How do I know that this lampstand actually stands for justice? But you know that because you're describing it, and often it only comes to you when you begin to describe it in the first person. And I think that can be helpful when you're writing a poem, because in a poem, as you work with it, you're going to go, will I change the first person to the second person? Will I put it into the future tense? Will I write it in the past tense? Will I write it in a disjointed way? Will I edit it in this way? And all the possibilities are in front of you. And what you need is some indigenous guides from within the language of this poem to know what's going to work and what has to stay steady. And by asking yourself the intelligence and hunger of the poem, and perhaps also by going in to allow the poem to speak back to you by saying, I am the poem. Suddenly you might go, wow, this poem is telling me something. And the things that it speaks, that's just the conversation between you and the poem. None of that might end up in the final piece, but it'll be in the underbelly of it, in the underground, in the unconscious of the poem, really. So, yeah. I think we're going to have some announcements, and then we're going to read the poem again and finish up. Is that right?
Thank you. I don't think any of us want to leave. That's the challenge. So yeah, a couple of announcements. Ro will send out an email to everyone. And if you'd like to share your poem, and if you'd also like to share what the poem's hunger is, what is it hungering for, and what is the poem's intelligence, you may also include that, and we'll speak to that in our write-up, our blog post write-up that we keep on our website. We'll be back next month on October 28th, and Manuel Iris will be joining us. You all met him in our last season together. I think that's really it. Ro, am I forgetting anything, or Eddie, or anyone else on the call? So thank you, everyone, and especially thank you, Padraig. So I'm going to allow you to read us out.
Padraig, before you begin, I just want to say thank you also, and encourage, if on Mondays and Fridays, Poetry Unbound is releasing episodes every Monday and Friday, and it's a great season. I've had a chance to see the poems and hear some of them before they've been released, and I'm excited for folks to hear them. So in the sake of embarrassing you, Patrick, just a little bit.
Thanks very much, Eddie. Eddie knows how much I enjoy attention. I'm nothing like that girl at the end. I need to become more like her. So Wonder Woman by Ada Limon. And just thank you to all of you. We create poetry together in this conversation. So thank you for what you wrote, what you shared, what you kept to yourself. All of those things are gifts. So Wonder Woman by Ada Limon. Standing at the swell of the muddy Mississippi after the urgent care doctor had just said, well, sometimes shit happens, I fell fast and hard for New Orleans all over again. Pain pills swirled in the purse along with a spell for later. It's taken a while for me to admit I am in a raging battle with my body, a spinal column 35 degrees bent, vertigo that comes and goes like a DC Comics villain nobody can kill. Invisible pain is both a blessing and a curse. You always look so happy, said a stranger once as I shifted to my good side, grinning. But that day, alone on the riverbank, brass blaring from the steamboat Natchez, out of the corner of my eye, I saw a girl, maybe half my age, dressed for no apparent reason as Wonder Woman. She strutted by in all her strength and glory, invincible, eternal, and when I stood to clap, because who wouldn't have, she bowed and posed like she knew I needed a myth, a woman by a river, indestructible.
Beautiful.
It's so nice to be with you all.
We will sadly make our little squares go away now.
Good night, everybody.
Good night. Thanks for staying up.
Oh, my pleasure. Oh, thanks, Birdie. Yes, Marie is a close friend. It was so much fun to do that conversation with her. Thanks, Julie.